Year was 1864. The town of Ashbourne sat buried in the gray heart of Pennsylvania, a place built on coal, sweat, and superstition. The war had taken its men, the mines had taken the rest, and those who survived lived in quiet fear of what the earth might claim next. When Father Elias Wren arrived in town, dressed in his worn black coat and carrying only a single suitcase and a Bible, the townspeople believed their prayers had finally been answered. He was a man of solemn grace, his voice soft but commanding, his eyes deep and calm, the kind of presence that made even the bitter widows of Ashbourne feel momentarily safe. The church he inherited, St. Bartholomew's Chapel, was old and half forgotten, its roof sagging like tired lungs, its bell long rusted into silence. Elias began his work immediately, cleaning the chapel, restoring the altar, and reopening its doors to a town that had lost faith years ago. But the first night he slept there, he awoke to a sound. It was faint, a whisper that seemed to crawl up through the cracks in the floorboards. At first he thought it was the wind. But the voice didn't waver like wind. It breathed. It spoke. And though the words were too soft to understand, one thing was certain: it was coming from beneath the chapel. In the following days, strange occurrences became common. Candles would light on their own. The air in the chapel would grow thick and cold, even when the fire still burned. During one morning prayer, Elias swore he saw movement in the corner, a shadow shaped like a man, kneeling among the pews though no one was there. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in scripture, but the whisper always returned at night, closer, clearer. One evening, as the bells of the distant town struck midnight, Elias heard his own name whispered from under the altar. Elias. The sound froze his breath. It was not a human tone. It was layered, like many voices speaking as one, echoing in strange harmony. He pressed his hand against the wooden floor, trembling, and whispered back, "Who's there?" The voice replied in fragments. "We are here, Father." The next morning, Elias confessed his fears to an old widow named Martha, who came daily to pray for her son lost in the mines. Her eyes filled with tears when Elias mentioned the voice. "You heard them," she said. "The miners. They never found their bodies. The mines swallowed them whole." Elias tried to reason with her, that grief could make the mind cruel. But as she left, she turned to him and whispered, "If the dead still speak, Father, maybe they want peace." That night, Elias knelt before the altar and prayed harder than ever before. He asked for guidance, for protection, for silence. But as his lips moved, the candles flickered out, one by one. The chapel fell into darkness. And then, a hand, pale and cold, rose from the shadows beneath the altar, its fingers brushing against the edge of the wooden step before sinking away. Elias staggered back, heart pounding, clutching his crucifix to his chest. "Lord," he gasped, "what have I brought upon this house?" Sleep abandoned him entirely after that night. He began writing in his journal, accounts of every sound, every flicker, every whisper. The entries grew longer, more frantic, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. But something had shifted inside him. The fear was still there, but so was fascination. If these were truly souls of the dead, then wasn't it his duty to help them find rest? One night, he lit the altar candles and spoke aloud to the darkness. "If you seek salvation, speak. Tell me what you need." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the floorboards trembled. The whispers returned, louder this time, a chorus of voices overlapping, pleading, crying, praying. Among them, he recognized one voice clearly, a man named Samuel Kerrigan, one of the miners who had perished months earlier. Elias had buried his wife's tears himself. The priest's throat tightened as the voice said, "Free us, Father. The earth keeps us, the fire won't let go." Elias fell to his knees. He wept, prayed, and promised he would not rest until they did. But as he rose, the last candle went out. From the darkness came a whisper softer than the rest, one that chilled him to his core. "We'll help you too, Father, if you help us first." When dawn came, Elias's journal bore new words, ones he didn't remember writing. They listen. They know. Salvation comes from below. By the next week, more people had begun attending his sermons. Word had spread that Father Wren could hear the dead. Some called it a blessing, others a curse. But the priest, once a man of faith, was slowly being pulled into something far older, something that did not belong to God. And beneath the chapel floor, the voices waited. The days in Ashbourne had grown colder, though the summer sun still lingered in the sky. Father Elias Wren found himself unable to escape the voices that now followed him even beyond the chapel walls. They whispered behind him in the streets, echoed faintly through the woods, and sometimes breathed from the mouths of parishioners as they came to confess their sins. He had tried to ignore them at first, convincing himself it was exhaustion, but denial crumbled with each passing night. The dead no longer waited for darkness to speak, they wanted to be heard. His journal filled with frantic entries, half prayers, half dialogues, where he argued with unseen presences and begged them for silence. Yet the more he listened, the clearer they became, their tone shifting from pleading to knowing, as if they understood him better than any living soul ever could. One evening, while alone in the chapel, Elias heard footsteps behind him and turned sharply, expecting Martha or one of the church caretakers. Instead, he found the old confessional curtain swaying gently, though no wind stirred the air. The faint creak of the wooden seat came next, followed by a voice from inside, calm and deliberate. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Elias froze. He hadn't heard those words in years. The miners had stopped confessing long before the collapse, and those who remained were too broken to speak of God. His hand trembled as he stepped toward the booth. "Who seeks absolution?" he asked, but there was no reply, only the sound of breathing, slow, uneven, like lungs filled with dust. He pulled open the curtain and found the seat empty. The door behind him shut hard. The crucifix on the wall swayed violently, as if the air itself had been struck. Then the whispers began again, this time inside his head, overlapping, urgent. "We are not forgiven, we are not free." He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but the voices grew louder until one cut through the noise, a voice he recognized. "Samuel Kerrigan. You promised us peace, Father. Why haven't you delivered it?" Elias pressed his forehead against the cold wood of the confessional, his breath shallow. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Show me what to do." The candlelight dimmed, flickered, and then steadied again. When Elias opened his eyes, there were handprints on the inside of the glass divider, blackened as if burned into the surface. The next morning he walked into town with sleepless eyes and trembling hands. The townspeople noticed his change, the way he looked through them instead of at them, how he paused to listen to sounds no one else could hear. A few began avoiding him, whispering that the priest had gone mad. Others, drawn by rumors, began leaving offerings at the chapel steps, tokens for their dead, prayers scrawled on scraps of paper, a child's toy, a lock of hair. Elias didn't stop them. Somewhere deep inside he knew the voices craved recognition. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in dying shades of red, Elias lit candles across the chapel floor and stood before the altar. He spoke aloud, his voice echoing through the hollow nave. "If you seek confession, come forth. I am here to listen." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the temperature dropped so sharply his breath fogged in the air. He could hear footsteps approaching, the shuffle of bare feet across stone. Shapes began to form in the flickering light. Translucent, shifting, faces half-formed as if caught between one world and the next. The first to speak was Samuel. "We were buried alive," he said, his voice breaking into echoes. "The mine closed around us, but our souls never left." Elias's throat tightened. "What holds you here?" he asked. Samuel's expression twisted into something that was not quite human. "The pact," he said. "We begged for salvation when the rocks fell. We offered our souls if only the pain would stop. And someone answered." Elias felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Who answered? The air trembled. A low, rumbling sound filled the chapel, a noise like distant thunder beneath the earth. Samuel's voice broke. "Not God." The candles went out at once, plunging the room into darkness. Elias's heart hammered in his chest as unseen hands brushed his shoulders, his face, his neck. The whispering rose again, louder, desperate. "We cannot rest. You open the door. You must finish what began." Elias stumbled backward, his foot catching the edge of the altar step. He fell hard, his candle rolling away, its embers still glowing faintly in the dark. As he scrambled to his feet, his gaze caught on the altar itself. The wooden base had cracked, and through the split, faint light glowed, red like embers deep within the earth. He knelt, reaching toward it, and when his fingers touched the seam, a sudden pulse of heat surged through his hand, searing his skin. He gasped and pulled back, but the mark that remained was not a burn. It was a symbol, circular, made of interlocking lines. That night, he bandaged his hand and wrote a single line in his journal. "The dead confess, but not to seek forgiveness. They confess to remind the living what they owe." As dawn broke over Ashbourne, the priest stood alone in the chapel, staring at the cracked altar, his faith trembling like the dying flame of a candle, knowing that whatever he had awakened beneath that church was only beginning to rise. The wound on Father Elias's palm refused to heal. Each morning he unwrapped the bandage, only to find the same symbol etched deeper into his flesh, as if burned by invisible fire. The lines glowed faintly at night, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match the whisper beneath the chapel. He tried everything, holy water, ash, prayer, but the mark persisted, alive and knowing. His sermons grew shorter, his eyes darker. The townspeople murmured that the priest had changed, that his voice carried something behind it now, something that made even the most faithful uneasy. The whispers from the floor returned each night, but now they didn't plead. They commanded. And Elias, against all reason, began to obey. He tore up sections of the chapel floor, exposing the earth below. The air that rose from the pit was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent, blood or something close to it. In his journal he wrote, "They are trapped. The earth is their prison, but I have been chosen to open the gate." He did not remember writing those words. Yet when he read them he felt no fear, only purpose. By the fourth night he began to see them even without the veil of candlelight. The miners, or what remained of them, appeared in flashes, hollow eyes, skin thin as wax, movements that rippled like water. They circled him as he worked, whispering the same phrase again and again, "Bring us the living." Elias resisted at first, horrified, but the more he heard it, the more it began to sound like divine instruction. The voices promised him understanding, peace, redemption for all souls, living and dead alike. He convinced himself he was still doing God's work. So when the first child went missing in Ashbourne, a small boy named Thomas who often lingered near the chapel steps, Elias prayed harder than ever. But when he knelt to pray, his lips moved in words he didn't recognize, ancient syllables that made the candles hiss and sputter. That night, he dreamed of the boy's face, pale, still, eyes open, half buried in earth beneath the altar. When he woke, his hands were covered in dirt. He didn't remember leaving the chapel. He didn't remember digging. Yet outside near the steps, the townspeople gathered in panic. They had found Thomas's shoe caked in mud and ash. Elias tried to comfort them, insisting the boy had wandered toward the woods, but the way his voice trembled betrayed him. Later, alone, he opened the trapdoor beneath the altar again. The light from below was brighter now, the air thick and humming. "You asked for peace," he whispered. "Why the child?" The voices answered in unison, not with anger, but hunger. "The living feed the promise. You opened the way." Elias stumbled back, gripping his rosary so tightly the beads cut his palm. The mark on his hand burned, and faint laughter, children's laughter, echoed through the chapel. He began fasting, desperate to purify himself, but the longer he starved, the clearer the voices became. They spoke to him in every silence, telling him where to dig, what to say, how to prepare. He no longer slept. He no longer dreamed. His sermons turned into warnings, raving about salvation through sacrifice. Attendance at the chapel dwindled, but a few desperate souls still came. Mothers mourning sons, men seeking forgiveness. And one by one they vanished. The sheriff came to question Elias after the third disappearance. He found the priest pale and feverish, his hands trembling, his voice distant. "Father," the sheriff said, "the people are afraid. They say you've been hearing things, doing strange things at night." Elias smiled faintly, a hollow, tired smile. "Faith is strange, Sheriff. When you hear the voice of God, it doesn't always sound holy." That night, as rain lashed the chapel roof, Elias knelt once more at the altar. He pressed his marked hand to the floor and whispered, "What do you want from me?" The earth answered in a deep, resonant tone that shook the walls, "Not what? Who?" By morning, the rain had stopped, but the church smelled faintly of decay. A few villagers who passed by swore they heard the sound of children singing from inside, even though no one had seen them enter. When the door creaked open, Father Elias stood alone before the altar, his robes soaked in mud, his eyes black with exhaustion. "They are closer now," he murmured to himself. "So close." And beneath his feet, the floor throbbed once, as if the ground itself had begun to breathe. By the time October crept over Ashbourne, Father Elias Wren was no longer the man the town had welcomed. His sermons had ceased, his eyes hollowed into dark, sleepless pits, and the chapel, once a refuge, had become a place no one dared enter after dusk. Rumors bled through the streets, that the priest was digging tunnels beneath the altar, that lights flickered under the floorboards at night, that the missing children's laughter could still be heard if one stood outside and listened hard enough. Elias himself barely noticed the world beyond his chapel anymore. His days were spent in prayer, his nights in the pit below, where the whispers had turned into a voice, a singular, commanding voice that called him shepherd. It told him what to do, what to say, and what to offer. And though his body trembled each time he obeyed, his soul no longer fought. Somewhere between faith and madness, he had surrendered. One night, as a storm tore across the Pennsylvania hills, Elias descended into the pit with a lantern clutched in his shaking hand. The air below was thick and warm, pulsing faintly like the inside of a living creature. Roots hung from the ceiling, glistening wet, twitching as if alive. He moved carefully, the dirt squelching beneath his boots, until he reached a wall that was not earth but stone, carved with the same symbol burned into his hand. At its center was a seam, thin but deep, pulsing faintly with red light. He placed his palm against it, and the stone shuddered, sighing like something asleep. The voice spoke again, deep and rhythmic, vibrating through his bones. "The covenant is nearly complete. Open the way, shepherd." Elias staggered back, breath ragged. "You promised salvation," he said. "You said they would be free." The voice replied, smoother now, almost tender. "They will. But freedom requires faith and flesh." The lantern flickered, and for a moment he saw faces, hundreds of them, shifting beneath the surface of the stone, their mouths opening in silent screams. He ran then, stumbling up the stairs into the chapel. Rain crashed against the windows, lightning tore across the sky. He fell before the altar, sobbing. "God forgive me," he whispered. "I've lost your voice among the others." But the crucifix above the altar had begun to tilt, the wood cracking as though something behind it was pushing forward. A low groan filled the air, not from wind, but from beneath. Elias stared, frozen, as the floorboards near the altar bulged upward. One by one the nails began to rise, tearing free. The whispering returned, thousands of voices now, pleading, laughing, crying, all overlapping in a terrible chorus. He covered his ears, screaming, "What are you?" The reply came as a single word that echoed from every wall: "Hungry." When the villagers arrived the next morning, they found the chapel doors locked from the inside. No answer came when they called for the priest. The sheriff ordered the door broken open, and when they entered, the smell hit them first, a stench of rot and damp earth. The altar had collapsed, half swallowed by the ground. The crucifix hung upside down. And Father Elias stood before it, alive but unmoving, his face streaked with ash, his eyes unfocused. He didn't speak as the sheriff grabbed his shoulder, only turned his head slightly and whispered, "It's open now." Beneath the chapel the earth had split wide. The tunnels Elias had dug were gone, replaced by a chasm that glowed faintly red, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sheriff peered down and swore he saw something moving in the dark, something vast and breathing. They pulled the priest from the church, but he didn't resist. His hands were clasped as if in prayer, his mouth still muttering verses that didn't belong to any scripture. That night, as the townspeople argued over what to do, the ground beneath Ashbourne trembled. Windows rattled. Dogs howled. And from the direction of St. Bartholomew's Chapel came a deep, low sound, like a choir singing far below the earth. In his cell, Elias finally spoke. "I thought I was saving them," he whispered. "But it wasn't them who needed saving. It was what waited below." He smiled then, a hollow, broken smile, and raised his marked hand. The symbol now glowed so brightly it lit the walls. "It's already begun," he said. And miles away, beneath the ruined chapel, something old and patient shifted in the dark, stretching for the first time in centuries, feeding on the prayers that had been whispered to it by a man who had mistaken the voice of the dead for the voice of God. Ashbourne did not sleep after the night the earth opened. The townspeople fled to nearby villages, abandoning their homes, their fields, and what remained of their faith. Those who stayed behind swore they could still hear the chapel bell ringing at odd hours, though the rope had long been torn away. Inside his cell, Father Elias Wren sat in silence. The mark on his palm had spread up his arm like veins of ember beneath his skin, glowing faintly in rhythm with something no one else could hear. Days blurred into nights, and the priest who once spoke only of mercy now spoke to the walls. "They're waiting," he whispered to himself, "and they remember every prayer that went unanswered." The sheriff tried questioning him again, but Elias only smiled, murmuring, "The door cannot be closed by those who opened it in faith." On the 7th night after his arrest, a miner's widow named Martha appeared at the station, soaked from rain. She begged to see the priest, clutching her son's old toy cross. Against his better judgment, the sheriff allowed it. As she entered the cell, Elias lifted his head for the first time in days. His eyes were sunken but alive with feverish clarity. "You still pray, Martha?" he asked softly. You still ask him to listen? Her lip trembled. I pray for peace, Father. Elias nodded. Then you're wiser than me. I prayed for answers. And something answered. He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. They're coming again tonight. Before she could ask who, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The sheriff and his men rushed outside as thunder rolled without lightning. The air smelled of iron and ash. From the hill where St. Bartholomew's once stood, a red glow seeped through the fog, flickering like fire beneath the soil. The church was gone, swallowed whole, its steeple jutting from the earth like a broken bone. The sound of chanting drifted on the wind, voices layered and distorted, singing in a language no one knew. Inside his cell, Elias began to pray aloud, not to God, but to whatever waited below. His words flowed like scripture, each syllable vibrating with a rhythm that shook the walls. The symbol on his arm flared, burning through his sleeve, and blood began to pour from his nose. Martha screamed, clutching her cross as his voice deepened beyond human pitch. Then the town went dark. Every lamp, every torch, every flame was snuffed out in an instant. The only light came from the direction of the chapel ruins, an unholy red pulsing brighter and brighter until it painted the sky. From miles away, travelers later said they saw shapes rising through that light, figures formed of smoke and ash, reaching upward, their mouths open as if singing. When dawn finally came, there was no sign of Elias, no sign of Martha, and the sheriff found his men gone without a trace. Only the cell door remained open, and carved into the wall behind it were words written in blood. The sermon is not over. Weeks passed. Search parties found nothing but cracked earth and scorched stones where the chapel had been. Yet the town never truly recovered. The ground around Ashbourne remained warm, trembling faintly as though something beneath it still moved. On quiet nights, those who dared to pass the ruins swore they heard a voice carried through the wind, a voice that once belonged to a priest. It recited fragments of scripture, twisted and inverted, ending always the same way, "The Lord is my shepherd, but I am his hunger." Years later, when the town was finally abandoned, travelers spoke of a light that still burned faintly on the hill where the chapel once stood. Some said it was the last remnant of a holy man's soul. Others whispered it was a beacon, a call to those who had ever prayed and never been heard. And deep below the hill, beneath the broken cross and the bones of Ashbourne, something ancient waited in silence. Not dead. Not alive. Listening. Because faith, once given, never truly dies. It only changes the one who answers.